Greetings again, students. This is the video lecture for the week 4 readings on foreign fighters. It's kind of a general category. Next week we'll look at battlefield effects more specifically and how foreign fighters can change conflicts. And then the week after that we'll look at a little bit about the recruitment process, but more so about the threat that returnees pose to their home countries, basically. So this week we kind of keep it more focused on foreign fighters as a general category. And the next few weeks we'll get into more specifics about them. So anyway, for this week there's a lot of readings, lots of videos to cover, so I'll try and be as brief as I can with a lot of this. But essentially I had you start off with Mallet and the Transnational Identity and Civil Conflicts piece. And there's a lot of stuff going on in here. We could theoretically move it a couple of weeks because it talks a lot about recruitment. You know, how do insurgencies recruit foreign combatants, basically. But there's some other stuff in there that's really good. I think it's a good way to start thinking about foreign fighters. He talks about a lot of the different cases, a lot of the different examples going back to the 1800s. He talks about the Spanish Civil War. So a lot of the stuff that we're going to read, that we read for this weekend coming up, focuses more on kind of post-Afghanistan foreign fighting, you know, and largely the Muslim foreign fighter phenomenon. So the Mallet piece does a good job of saying, hey, yeah, that's important, but there's a lot of other stuff that was going on in the past. So one of his main points, right, is that transnational recruitment occurs when local insurgents attempt to broaden the scope of the conflict to increase resources and maximize chances of victory. But in order to motivate outsiders to join for reasons other than material gain, because they don't have a lot of resources to give, then they overcome the collective action problem by framing conflicts as necessary defensive mobilizations to individuals active and share ethnic, religious, or ideological ties. So it's important, you know, this is important because this is pretty much how you would frame any conflict, regardless of ethnic, ideological, or political or religious connections. You know, how do you get people in a distant land to care about a conflict in your location, and how do you get them to care enough to come and potentially contribute and fight for you, right? So one of the ways, the thing that Mallet identifies is, look, the one through line through all this is that they present the conflict as a threat to whatever community it may be. So, you know, if it's, you know, in Afghanistan, it was a threat to the Islamic community. Same thing in Chechnya, right? In Spanish Civil War, it was a threat to democracy, you know, and a threat to kind of liberty and freedom. And you know, in Israel, it was a threat to the Jewish religion and the Jewish ethnicity as well. So, you know, you create this, you appeal to this shared community tie that you have, whether it's religious, ethnic, or otherwise, and then you focus on whatever's happening as a threat to that community. And, you know, this happens in a lot of political violence, actually. The Army of God is an example that I can think of, you know, who, you know, they frame their anti-abortion rhetoric in terms of, you know, these abortions are a threat to God's will. They're a threat to our community and who we consider ourselves to be, and so we need to, this is what the Army of God says, you know, that we need to do something about these abortions and reduce these because they're threatening us. So anyway, that's, you know, it's not mind-boggling or world-changing, but it does a good job of specifying what that key component is that we can look at for recruitment to take place. So aside from that, I really like his definition of foreign fighters, you know, non-citizens of conflict states who join insurgencies during civil conflicts, excluding mercenaries and private security companies. That's on page 9 of the piece that I gave you. So I think that's a really clear definition. I think it's not oversimplified, but it's not overly complex. This is the definition I use in a lot of my writing. You know, that Heghammer has a good definition, but, you know, he includes this, you know, they, you know, participate without, you know, expectation of you know, making money, you know, and so without the expectation of material gain, I think is what he says. But that could definitely be a motivation. It could be one of many motivations, right? In Syria, you know, Islamic State has promised wives and land and, you know, some money, and, you know, that has been a big draw for a number of the recruits. It's not the whole reason by any means, but it's part of the reason. And it would be silly to say that in any of these conflicts, these transnational insurgents or foreign fighters are joining without any concern for material gain. And I think Hegghammer really limits himself when he talks about that, right? So anyway, I really like Mallett's definition a lot. He talks about mercenaries, and he says, look, mercenaries aren't totally excluded. It's just that mercenaries are typically employed by the state, and so are private security contractors, right? So in Iraq, it's not the insurgents that are paying Blackwater; it's the Iraqi government via the American government, So if you have mercenaries or private security companies that are fighting on the side of the insurgency, then I think that would be something that you would term a foreign fighter, or we would define it as such under this. But when those that are being hired specifically to fight in a conflict are doing so on the government side, then we exclude them from this category of foreign fighter. And so, a lot of traditional conceptions of mercenaries would be excluded for that. So not all, and that's an important distinction. But anyway, I think that's a good definition, and you're welcome to use that in your paper moving forward. Let's see, he also discusses a little bit about frame bridging and the importance of being able to connect or link two or more ideologically congruent or consistent frames, but structurally unconnected. So two things that are similar, like the Muslim community. In Chechnya, there's a sense of what the Muslim community, what the Ummah looks like, and that's different, although very similar, but different in some ways from what you would see in Saudi Arabia or Tunisia or some other places, Afghanistan, some other places where we saw foreign fighters come from to go to Chechnya. So finding a way to link those two, and again, this is where the role, and this guy gets talked about, Azam Abdullah, the bin Laden's kind of mentor, this was one of his big contributions, was to think of the Islamic community as something that transcends national borders, and that and ethnicity, that your citizenship to a certain country and your ethnicity don't matter as much as your religious identification as a Muslim. And that framework allows you to bridge things on two sides that are very similar, but were not otherwise before connected. And so that's an important aspect of how we can think about how these transnational linkages can be strengthened to then utilize these linkages to help out in civil conflicts, right? To help the side of the insurgents. So frame bridging, and that's a concept from Taro, but it's another important way. It takes an active process to think about how can we get these things to fit under the same heading so that we can appeal to these people. And a couple of his other important contributions, he looks at the distribution of civil conflicts, and he says, look, civil conflicts with foreign fighters are not more likely to be ethnic in nature, which is important. We're not just talking about ethnicity when we're talking about foreign fighters. We are talking about religion. We are talking about political affiliation. And if you go back to history, the Communist International, and there were people that were loosely connected to states, but also kind of on their own, that were out there training guerrilla forces in different places in the world, and that had nothing to do with ethnicity. That was a ideological political leaning. And then his other point, that the prevalence of foreign fighters has been increasing since the end of the Cold War. So we know that civil war and insurgency and civil conflict has been increasing. And so as that increases, then foreign fighter participations can increase, of course. But on top of that, even just controlling or accounting for the increase in civil conflicts, we're seeing more and more foreign fighters, even relative to the increase in civil war. So foreign fighters are becoming more prevalent, and that's another key point. His dissertation was written in 2009, so that was 8 years ago, before the Syria civil war, and so now we need to take that into account when we're looking at what the state of the world looks like today, right? And a lot of our readings this week talk about that. All right, so without further ado, moving on to the Hegghammer piece, The Rise of the Muslim Foreign Fighter. This is another really good piece, really, really well written and well designed. I have problems with his definition of foreign fighter, but he talks about Mallet, and he talks about some of these other things that have been done. So his goal is to explain how you get the rise of this what we dub the foreign fighter phenomenon, and especially the Muslim foreign fighter phenomenon. And interestingly enough, he finds that it has a lot to do with this violent offshoot of populist pan-Islamism, which basically came about in the 70s when people that were exiled, there were members of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Jordan and some other places. They were exiled, and they went to go live in the Hijazi region of Saudi Arabia, and they came together and they said, look, we're not going to be able to do much in Saudi Arabia. It is the way that it is, but maybe we can, create a set of linkages and networks that go across the kind of Middle East and North Africa and wherever Muslims are. And so they created a bunch of charities, they created educational groups, they created a lot of what we would think of as NGOs. They ran, basically an NGO sector, and got that started. And there was a lot of money. If the rise in oil prices, and Saudi Arabia has a lot of money, so if you were in that business, you were making that money. So they had a lot of resources to spread around, and so they did. And they formed this, web of NGOs, most of which were legitimate, and some of which were meant to funnel funds and resources to, Muslim communities that were potentially in danger. And so, and again, this is where this kind of resource mobilization theory comes in, right? That like, you don't have Afghanistan, and you don't have the resources and the guns in Afghanistan, but you also don't have the people. The message of what's going on in Afghanistan and why is it so important to everybody else. I mean, somebody may have come up with that, that was in Afghanistan at that time, but to get it spread beyond those borders, you need to have a network, and you need to have resources to spread that message. And this pan-Islamic movement in the Hijazi region of Saudi Arabia provided that, right? So without the expulsion of the Muslim Brotherhood, you don't have the Hijazi pan-Islamic movement. Without that, you don't have Afghanistan. Without Afghanistan, you don't have Chechnya on the scope that you do, or Syria on the scope that you do, right? That these are all connected events. There's a history that's going on here that we can trace, much like Bruce Hoffman when he was talking about kind of the history of terrorism. There's this history of kind of transnational insurgency, and Mallet discusses that as well, but specifically Muslim transnational insurgency, and that's what Hegghammer is looking to explain. So it's interesting that it's like this elite competition that drove this. The elites were trying to gain power, and how can I influence the Muslims abroad, and how can I have an effect on these things? I bet they were pretty upset because they got exiled from their home country, so they're probably trying to exert power, and that kind of power competition led to the rise of this NGO network, and that helped fuel funds and resources and people to where they needed to go for these conflicts to become way bigger in scope than they would have been before. And so, he talks about the norms and networks that enabled these Arab activists in the 1980s in Afghanistan, allowed them to recruit these foreign fighters. And this mobilization, in turn, produced the foreign fighter movement as it still exists today. And there's no denying it. Afghanistan looms large, and the Mujahideen looms large over everything that we're talking about in Syria and in Chechnya and elsewhere where there are Muslim foreign fighters, right? That kind of specter of Afghanistan looms large. So, let's see. At the end of his analysis, he talks. He says basically, look, we've talked about the Muslim foreign fighter phenomenon, but foreign fighters in general, on this kind of their ability for them to operate on a large scale and to have these large scale mobilizations, you need two things. You need an ideology stressing solidarity with an imagined transnational community. He says, look, that's everywhere. And that's Keck and Sinkink and Della Porta, and talking about the rise of NGOs and the rise of these transnational linkages. That's increasing day by day. But what you also need is a strong cadre of transnational activists. And again, that's part of what Afghanistan provided, right? And as you send people there, you start to build up this cadre, and those people can then go elsewhere to other conflicts. And so if you have those two things, then you're going to see foreign fighters. And again, what do we see in Syria? Very similar to Afghanistan, but we see the Islamic State, bringing in these former foreign fighters from Afghanistan, as well as, linking up, organizations that use terrorism in the area, and creating alliances and bringing in new people and all that stuff to create this strong cadre of transnational activists. And so it helps to explain in a very simple way why we're seeing what we see in Syria. And it helps, if we're policymakers, it helps us to look, what are we going to look for in the future for these kinds of, events to occur, right? So moving on to the Moore piece, the Kerwin Moore piece, transnational activism in the North Caucasus. one of his focuses is on this kind of shared identity and fictive kinship, right? The connectedness and bonds that evolve over time. So as opposed to blood kinship, which can't really evolve, you are related to that person or you're not. Fictive kinship is the kind of thing that you make up. It's like brothers in arms, or people who are not of your family, but that you may identify with in a stronger way than the people from your own family, and that those kind of ties are really what's driving people to want to come and fight. He also just talks a lot about local support and acceptance is very important. Typically, foreign fighters don't just show up and say, "Hey, I'm ready to fight." Typically, the first thing that happens is that the local insurgents ask for foreign fighters to come. Right? There's like a call that goes out, and like Tajikistan, which is one of the cases that I've looked at, the Tajikistan civil war. You basically had Ibn Khattab and a couple other contingents of basically foreign fighters, former foreign fighters from the Afghan conflict, and they were exiled from their homelands, from their home countries, and they were basically just hanging out in Afghanistan for a couple of years after the Soviets left, and they were kind of trying to figure out what they wanted to do because they couldn't go home, and so Tajikistan, it was experiencing the civil war, and the United Tajik Opposition was made up of a couple of different contingents, but one of them was the Islamic contingent, and the Islamic part of the UTO basically said, "Hey, we'd like foreign fighters to come. People, Afghan jihads, we'd like them to come down." And so Khattab and his regiment and a couple others moved across the border up into Tajikistan, fought there for a couple of years. They were fairly effective, very indiscriminate in their killing. They used a lot of bombs and went after kind of civilian populations in towns and that kind of thing. So the domestic insurgents were like, "No, that's not what we want," and they basically started to tell them to do less and less and had them stay home, back at the home base more often. And right around that same time is when Khattab got an invitation to go to Chechnya, and so they said, "Well, we're not really welcome anymore in Tajikistan, so let's go to Chechnya." And Khattab wound up being a big influence on the conflict there. And so again, it's this invitation, from the local insurgents to, "Hey, come down and help us with this insurgency we're trying to fight." And again, the kind of acceptance of the local population is pretty important. If they don't accept you, it's going to be harder to have an effect on the conflict. And sometimes people are held back because they're not accepted. Other times they may be accepted by the community, go out and use violence more indiscriminately than the local population would prefer, and then they get pulled out of the fighting, right? So those local dynamics, the interplay between the foreigners and the local insurgents is very important, right? And next week we're going to talk about that even more in regards to battlefield effects, that it's going to be hard to have battlefield effects if you don't make it past the domestic gatekeepers. So look for more of that next week. But let's see, more in general, he's got another interesting definition of foreign fighters, which is a little different. He really wants to call them transnational activists, and I think that that's not wrong. I think that's actually probably more technical. But foreign fighters has become a term that is ubiquitous, and everybody knows what that means, so it's easier to refer to them as such. But I think he's right that transnational activists who are using insurgency or terrorism as a strategy is technically what we're talking about. That just doesn't fit in a newspaper line quite as well as foreign fighters does, right? So, and he also talks a little about how the motivations can be very different from person to person, and that motivations can be different in the same person, right? And so we shouldn't try and attribute all this to one reason. Oh, there's one reason why everybody goes to fight. So, an inability of some groups to return home or to reintegrate into local communities also appears to influence decisions to participate in Syria. So again, much like Khattab, who couldn't go back to Saudi Arabia, was stuck in Afghanistan after the Civil War, gets this invitation to go to Tajikistan. All right, let's go do it, because what else have we got going on? And we're not going to be allowed back, and we can't go home, so let's go on to the next conflict. And for some of these guys, that's their way of life. They move from conflict to conflict to conflict, and there's up times, where there's a lot of battle and a lot of things going on, and there's down times where they're, sitting around. But either way, they're basically in some theater or campaign, or have been since Afghanistan in some way, shape, or form. So anyway, it might be these fictive kinship, it might be monetary gain, it might be honor or privilege or respect, and it also might be a lack of something better, a better alternative. and an inability to go home. Well, we got nothing else. Let's go on to the next thing. So, anyway, those are a couple of his points, and we're going to read some more of Kerwin's work next week as well. So, okay, finally, for the big papers, we got the Mendelssohn piece on the recent trends in foreign fighters. He talks about this definition of foreign fighters and kind of gets into these complexities, which is real fun. I think it's technical, but I think it, again, use the definition that works best for you, that you find most fitting and that fits your data. One of the reasons I use David Mallett's definition is because I use his data, and he defines and codes foreign fighters a certain way. I agree with that. If I didn't, I would recode, but it's useful for the data set I'm trying to analyze. So, use definitions that fit your analysis. I think that's really important. But if we want to go off into the weeds a little bit on this, foreign fighters hinge on this concept of foreign, and that refers to nationality, and that's in the state-centric system. And again, we've talked about this throughout, that the international relations school of thought is very much based on this state-centric system. So we're trying to explain a transnational non-state phenomenon to a group of state-centric actors. It's okay for us to use this in that when we're talking to policymakers and other people who are familiar with this stuff. But when you talk to a foreign fighter, they're going to say, I'm not foreign. I'm from a different place, but I share more in common with these people than I do with some of the people in my own homeland. That would be their answer, right? And so this thing that we dub them to be foreign fighters, again, is all based on the state-centric concept. And if you see yourself as a part of a global community, then can you really be foreign? You can be foreign to the land, but not to the community. So again, I think that's an interesting point to bring up, and it's important for their sense of identity, right? That how they see themselves is going to define when they want to get involved. So it is important in that sense. And how are they recruiting, and how are they thinking of themselves as part of this group, but not part of this group? There are different levels of foreignness that he talks about. Province of origin, ethnic group, tribe, subclan. There's a whole bunch of different ways that you can be foreign. You could be from the next town over, but be from a different subclan and be really foreign. Or you could be from way across the, part of the diaspora community, way across the world, but part of the same clan, speak the same language. You're less foreign than that guy in the next village over, so to speak. So, and this helps to explain why certain areas attract more external volunteers and varying levels of receptiveness to external assistance. So there's going to be different places that are going to have more of those transnational linkages. Again, diaspora communities is something we talk about a lot. People that have already been forced to or have chosen to leave an area, go off somewhere else, and then return. So external assistance can come from that kind of, it's more likely in places where you have these kind of large diaspora communities. Let's see. He also talks about that, when we talk about a foreign fighter contingent in a certain conflict, there's a diverse group of fighters, usually, not just one coherent group. So in Somalia, you had kind of the near diaspora, the people that were from Kenya and Ethiopia. You had the far diaspora, these are the people that were, in Europe and in the United States. And then you have non-Somali Muslims, who are literally just Muslims who identify with the conflict, but they're not even Somalians. So even in that foreign fighter contingent in Somalia, you have three distinct different groups, that are there for kind of a potentially different reasons, but they have different origins, and that, can affect the coherence of the group or the effectiveness of the group as well. And it can also affect how local fighters are received by locals and their potential to impact the conflict. So again, we talked about that a little bit, but how you're seen by the locals and whether or not you're allowed to participate in what you're allowed to do has a big effect on your ability to change that conflict. And again, we'll get into that more next week. So there's a really good quote in there that kind of sums up a little bit of what we're talking about. And he says, for locals, American forces in Iraq are more foreign than the jihadi volunteers from Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Right? That, again, a lot of this has to do with identity and kind of perceptions. And even though these insurgents might be coming from Saudi Arabia and Yemen to here, I identify with them. This is what the local would say. The locals would say, I identify with those people way more than I identify with these American military who are on our soil. We see that as a foreign occupation, whereas they'll see the Yemens and the Saudis as kind of like friends lending a helping hand, in a time of need or something like that. And again, whether that's right or wrong is a different story, but that's how some people can see it. And then, finally he talks about these two broad categories of foreign fighters. A foreigner fighting in a local conflict, which is what we typically think of as a foreign fighter, but also a foreign trained fighter who receives training and comes back to carry out an attacks on their home country or elsewhere, right? And he says, look, the traditional model that we think of might be losing ground to this new model. And so that's something that I think it's important to think about moving forward with the foreign fighter phenomenon in the future, is how much, and this is where the returnee debate, a lot of this comes down, battlefield effects versus returnees. Are they a bigger threat in the conflict itself, or are they a bigger threat to the home country when they go back? And so that helps to set up why there's this distinction in the first place. But, given the kind of rise of globalization and all these other things that are taking place, I think it's safe to say that it's going to be more and more prominent in the future, because people will go and they'll train and then they will go somewhere else and use those tactics there. I think that's going to grow in prevalence. It may not take over the original model. I still think that it still has a lot of power. Much like the Foreign Legion, kind of held this like position of, it's so exotic. I'm going to go do this adventurous, exotic thing in the Foreign Legion. And that was 150 years ago. Today, it's a similar thing. It's kind of like it can be like the Foreign Legion and have that same appeal to people. So I don't think it'll ever go away, but I think that he makes a good point that this kind of newer model is starting to displace the older model. Then he talks about this life cycle, and this is important. We're going to talk about this next week and the week after too, but this life cycle of a foreign fighter, where there's the pre-war, the kind of radicalization and the mobilization part that takes place. How do you get to be radical enough to where you want to travel, and then how do you travel to get there? What do your connections look like? What's that pathway look like? Again, we talked about profiles to pathways last week. Here it is again. But what's that pre-war pathway look like? Then the war stage, when you're there, what do you do? And then finally the post-war stage. What do you do after you're done with the war when you come home? Or do you come home? And then for that war stage, he talks about these different roles that foreign fighters can have. Of course there are fighters, but this is probably more rare than it is common. It's probably more common to have these other these other roles. And so there's the fighting forces and field commanders. Again, those exist, but those are probably not the majority. You have terrorists and terrorist planners. And again, people with Western passports, and these passports, this ability to go back to their home countries, they're going to be deemed terrorists, not insurgents, because they're not using an insurgency strategy, they're using a terrorism strategy. So he says that actually foreign fighters are more effective as terrorists and as terrorist planners. They can be conveyors of knowledge or trainers. And so, like, for example, I know the IRA sent a couple of guys to Colombia in the 80s or 90s to train the FARC in bomb making. And sure enough, the battlefield deaths in that conflict went up in the couple of years after they were there. The use of bombs and the use of explosive devices increased significantly, which increased the lethality of the conflict. Also, I know the BAS, the ETA fighters in the IRA, had met up at one point to kind of, share ideas, and the Red Brigades in Italy have had some of these connections where they're kind of training or receiving training from different places. That takes place a lot more than I think people give it credit for. That's one of Al-Qaeda's big things, actually, is their training camps, right? Their ability to get people in, train them not only to, in insurgent tactics, but also in these terrorist tactics and bomb making. So training is a big one. And then recruiters, there's a big role for recruiters, still need that. Online only does so much. In-person recruiting is the best way to ensure that you can get somebody from point A to point B. And then media production, and this is again something that kind of Western foreign fighters have been, and foreign fighters from other places can translate into their home languages. They can, present the conflicts in a frame that's easily understood by people that are there. And so, the media production is another important aspect. And those people that are producing the media might never see the front lines, right? So they're in the backside of the conflict, trying to get more people to come down, or trying to get support or build up, international recognition for something. So there's a lot of different roles that foreign fighters can play aside from just a combat role. So Mendelssohn does a good job of talking about that. I did highlight this one phrase in there, that there are some indications that foreign fighting has gone out of fashion somewhat. He wrote this in 2011. I thought that was pretty funny because that was before the advent of the Syria conflict, and so I think it's safe to say that that prediction is false for the time being, given what we see. I think these things happen in cycles. You know, this Syria war right now is like Afghanistan in the 1980s, and it's gonna leave a lasting legacy like that. What happens after Syria ends? You can't kill all members of the Islamic State. So a lot of them have gone home. So those people are out there, and much like the veterans from the Afghan Mujahideen spread out into other conflicts and did a whole bunch of things, veterans from the Syria war are going to do the same thing, both in other conflicts, in civil conflicts, and also at home. So there's a great book called Jihad Joe by J.M. Berger, and it looks at Americans who go to fight in the name of Islam abroad, and talks about a lot of what they're trying to do when they came back home and stuff like that. So there's a lot of discussion about, and again in that book, all of it has to do with kind of veterans of the Afghan war. So that specter looms large, and Syria is going to do the same thing. 20 years from now, when somebody teaches this class, they're going to be talking about Syria on the same level as Afghanistan. That's my prediction. So, all right, just to wrap it up, because this has gone a little long, I really apologize, but there's a lot of material. You had the two reports, the Sufine Group report, the Barrett et al. Piece, and this, helps you to see where foreign fighters are coming from. 84 countries, 20 to 30,000 people. It's a lot of people. It's a big contingent, arguably bigger than what was in Afghanistan. But they come from all over the place, and mostly Tunisia, Saudi Arabia, Jordan. Those are some of the big contributors, and I know Tunisia's having a real big problem with returning foreign fighters right now, and there's legislation that they're trying to pass to outlaw people from returning, and again, that might be good for Tunisia. It might not be good for other places, because then they'll stick in Syria until something else opens up, and then they'll go over to that conflict. So anyway, and then in the Western world, France, UK, Germany, and Belgium have the biggest contingents, and a lot of that has to do with diaspora communities, right? And kind of first generation and second generation immigrants to those areas. The U.S., Canada, Mexico, South America, much lower numbers. And part of that has to do with the distance, and part of it has to do with just kind of the framing of the conflict and the connections that people have in their diaspora communities in Europe versus the connections they have in diaspora communities here. So, and then the other piece was the other foreign fighters in Syria, the Patin piece, and again, that's only looks at 108, but there are Americans that are in Syria fighting against ISIS as well. And this, happened in the Spanish Civil War, right, where there were people that were fighting on the side of the government, and that's where the Abraham Lincoln Brigade was fighting, was trying to defend the government, and then the rebels, the loyalists, had strong ties to the Catholic Church, and so there were a number of American Catholics who went to Spain to fight for the loyalists against the democratic government. So again, you can have foreign fighters that go on both sides. So that's just important to remember too, that there can be different, even in the same conflict, there can be different contingents of foreign fighters on one side, and there can be different contingents of foreign fighters on both sides. So I think it's just important to keep that in mind. And then you have the two videos, the American lone soldiers in the IDF, which is a really interesting video. It's basically a propaganda piece for the Israeli Defense Force, and so it's not meant to be strictly educational in the sense, it's meant to be strictly educational. It's not meant as a propaganda piece, so I hope nobody took it that way. But I think it's important to recognize the framing that they take in this, the style of the video. It starts off with kind of like a really pretty view of Israel and kind of like a resort quality to it. And then throughout they talk about, how happy they are to fight for a cause, and, how difficult it was, challenging, but it taught them something about themselves, and, they're so happy that they gave themselves over to something bigger than themselves. That is recruitment 101, right, for any army. And so these same techniques and these same concepts are being used by the Islamic State and other groups to try and get people to come fight for them. And so it's interesting that the IDF has this video. And again, those aren't foreign fighters because they're fighting, they're soldiers that are fighting on behalf of the government. they're more akin to mercenaries, I would think. But either way, you still have people to go fight Americans and others to go fight in the Israeli army. So anyway, I think that's a good video for that. And then lastly, the Abraham Lincoln Brigades. I put that in there. I think that's a fascinating historical example of foreign fighting. And I think, in a strict definition, these were not just foreign fighters. They were fighting on the side of the government because, again, the democratically elected government was still in power, and it was Franco and the loyalists that were actually the rebels. But anyway, it's still a great historical piece. The role of foreigners in a battlefield was negligible. Sorry, there's some stuff going on. So they talk about how the battlefield effects were negligible. They didn't really change the conflict, but they did have some influence politically, right? And they talk about how FDR's mind was kind of changing as he was, watching these conflicts and watching these things develop, and that may have, led to him giving more support, even clandestinely, to Europe at that time. So, and this is similarly for foreign fighter contingents. Sometimes they don't do anything to the conflict itself. They're pretty ineffective, but it can galvanize people, both for and against the insurgents, to come and become more involved, right? Look at Russia's involvement in Syria. If the Islamic State didn't have the flow of foreign fighters that they did, do you think Russia would have gotten involved? I don't know. It's a counterfactual, but some would argue that the use of these foreign fighters and the rise of these foreign fighters is enough of a concern that Russia wanted to get themselves involved in the war. In George Orwell's Catalonia, Homage to Catalonia, which is a really, really good book, he fought in the war for a couple of months, and then Ernest Hemingway wrote the Fifth Column as he was evacuating Spain. He was there as a reporter to report on the Spanish Civil War. So you have some pretty famous names that were at that conflict and felt that it was important to be a part of it. So anyway, okay, well, I've taken up too much of your time, and I apologize for such a long lecture this week. But we got through everything. There's a lot of ground to cover here. But again, I think what's important is to kind of look at these things in the sense of like framing opportunities and resources. How did they leverage the resources that they had to get people involved? How did they take advantage of opportunities? Whether it's open borders or whether it's a weak state or whether it's a change, a shift in public opinion. How did they use those? And then finally, how do they frame things to be able to get people involved and to do what they want to do? So you have a lot, all these are three key components in the discussion of foreign fighters. And next week when we talk about battlefield effects, when we talk about returnees and stuff like that, social movement theory has a little bit less of an impact when we're thinking about that stuff. This is the social movement theory kind of leads us to how they affect conflict and what they do when they come back. But for this week especially, I think we're still tied into that social movement thinking, and that's the biggest the biggest thought that I want you to keep in mind, when you're thinking about how these readings relate to each other in the discussion board for the week and that kind of thing. So anyway, I hope you found the lecture interesting and insightful, and I hope everything else is going well. And thanks for watching, and I will see you next week. All right, bye.